Welcome to Sykotic Stories, Episode 2, The Darkness. James hugged his family and told them he loved them. The doctors told him he doesn't have long to live. He was diagnosed 2 months ago with advanced inoperable pancreatic cancer. The doctors did everything within their power. Now it was just a waiting game and a downhill slope until he was dead. His family was devastated. James was a good father to his son Randy and his daughter Michelle. They were a close-knit family who always watched each other's backs. James was a thoughtful husband, and his wife Janice was fiercely devoted to him. James, though, carried around a dark burden all his life. His parents were violent drug addicts. They would lock him in a closet for days when he was little and force him to do terrible things that would have and should have destroyed any young child's psyche. James thought back about a particularly traumatic event where his parents told him to kill a stray puppy that had wandered into their yard. James didn't want to do this, as he had always wanted a puppy, and he didn't want to hurt anything. James took the puppy to the tree line in their yard and begged the puppy to run off into the woods, but the puppy wouldn't. James's father walked up from behind, grabbed James by the neck, held a knife to his throat, and in his scariest voice, his father said, "You kill a fucking dog or I'm gonna slit your throat, you little fuck. No one would miss you." James couldn't move. His dad grabbed the puppy and put the knife in James's hand. Tears filled James's eyes, and he felt his stomach twist in knots. He begged. James's father planted his fist in his gut. James couldn't breathe. His dad took his hand with the knife and forced him to jab it into the puppy's eye. The puppy cried out a terrible shriek. James followed with his own horrific cry. Blood sprayed as James' hand continued to involuntarily tear the puppy to shreds while it squirmed and cried out in horrible, gasping, rattled breaths. James blacked out. He remembers waking up in bed, covered in blood. He cried silently every night for years after that. James pondered this terrible memory and wondered how his parents could have been so screwed up. James was only 33 years old. He couldn't understand why he had been dealt such a crappy hand in life. The only saving grace had been his wife and kids, and now he was leaving them all alone in this cruel world. How could he be sure the same things that happened to him wouldn't happen to his kids? Who's to say that when he dies, Janice won't marry someone as demented as his parents? He wouldn't be able to do anything about it. He was a dead man. James stared blankly at the ceiling as he dozed off to sleep in a morphine stupor. In the morning, he awoke, or so he thought, to his wife shrieking in terror. James tried to open his eyes. He tried to move his head to look at his wife shrieking. He couldn't move his head. He couldn't feel anything at all. His wife was still screaming like someone was attacking her. He couldn't see anything. He felt cold, freezing cold. Her voice started to fade away. He felt as though he was melting or evaporating. He saw a bright light at the end of a long tunnel. He couldn't resist floating towards the light. In the distance, he could make out a figure shadowed out by the bright light. As he moved closer to the figure, James could see that it appeared to be a being made of shadow. Tall and thin, but utterly black. No facial features to speak of or defining features. It was just total darkness. He felt the inky figure reach out to him with its mind. There were no words, only hunger. He started to feel as if this being was not here to welcome him, but to take possession of him. The closer James got to the figure, the more he could sense what it wanted. This was not a Jesus figure or James' loved ones who'd passed away. This was total oblivion. Chaos personified. James tried to will himself in the other direction, veer away from the dark figure, but it was no use. It was as if James was caught in some sort of tractor beam that he had no hope of escaping. James felt hopeless. The being spoke in some strange language that seemed inhuman. James was now just a few feet away from the figure. It seemed the closer he got to this being, the harder it was for James to see anything else. He felt it consuming him at the very core of his nature. This was not something natural, but something utterly inconceivable. The being reached an inky black limb out towards James, and he felt it penetrate his soul. As the being began to engulf James's essence, he began to panic. There was nothing he could do. He had suffered most of his life. He wasn't suffering for his sins, though, James knew. This was a predator. Some unknown horror that exists in some other dimension, only detectable after the death of the physical body. James was the prey. He thought of his kids and what their lives would be like growing up without a father. He would never get to see them grow, never grow old with his wife. If James had eyes, he would have began to sob. He began letting out what felt like terrible, guttural screams, with no sound. Each scream contained the pain and agony of 1,000 lifetimes. James was no longer James. James was now nothing. He again tried to scream as he felt what would have been his insides, if he had a body, being ripped out slowly. Flashes of the dark being would haunt him. Eternity seemed to pass. The pain was continuous and all-encompassing. James' wife sat by the window, staring blankly at the rain outside. Her kids were asleep beside her on the couch. They had all spent the last 48 hours in tears, sobbing. James had only been dead for 17 hours, but he had been in much worse shape than before during the last 24 hours before he passed. He was better off this way. She was angry with him, though. She felt terrible about it. It wasn't his fault, after all. But it wasn't her fault either. Janice heard a sound come from the bedroom. Movement. Both the kids were right here, and there was no one else in the house. What was that? She thought to herself. She continued to cry. Then another noise came from the bedroom, this time louder. Janice wiped her eyes and stood up to go see what was making the sound in the bedroom. She opened the door to the bedroom, but the room was empty. She heard a thump in the bathroom. She inched closer to the bathroom door, and she heard a voice. "Janice," said the voice. Janice gasped. She opened the door to the bathroom, fully expecting to see James. In the bathroom was nothing. Janice rubbed her eyes. Was she losing it? All the stress was getting to her. She had been awake too long and in shock for the last day. Surely she was hearing things. That night, Janice had vivid dreams of James. He was still dead in her dreams, but he was talking to her. He told her all sorts of terrible stories about his childhood, and she cried and told him she was sorry and that she loved him. "I'm so sorry, baby. I had no clue," she told him. James wrapped his arms around her, and she recoiled at the smell of his rotting flesh. James looked angry with her, and she immediately felt guilty. He told her he still loved her and went to wrap his arms around her. She held her breath as he squeezed. She didn't want to upset him, but the smell was horrendous. Janice could feel his arms around her, squeezing her, and she felt her gag reflex trigger. She held it back and tried to push James away gently to look at him. When she pushed away, she felt his arms grip tighter around her. He whispered in her ear, "Make love to me one more time, Janice. Let's spend one last night in each other's arms." The thought of spending one more night with James made her heart jump, but then she remembered. He's dead. This thing is not James. Only his corpse. And she was only dreaming. She looked James in the eye and said, "No, you're not here." James looked at her, confused. "What?" he asked. "You're not here. You're dead. And this is a dream," she exclaimed. James' facial expression turned dark and sinister. "Oh, I'm here, and I'm going to do whatever I want to you." James pulled out a ridiculously shaped blade and thrust it towards her. It caught her right in the throat. She could feel the blade go into her windpipe and the blood start to choke her. James grabbed her by the hair and pulled her towards his face. Black goo was oozing from his mouth now, and his eyes were jet black, and looking into them felt as if they were ripping out her soul. He smashed his mouth against hers, and she felt a dry, cold lizard-like tongue go into her mouth, with the black goo flowing freely down her already blood-flooded windpipe. She let out a blood-curdling scream as she woke up, soaked with sweat, on the bathroom floor. James could feel the malice of the dark shadow being holding him down. The thing was getting pure pleasure out of James' pain and suffering. James could feel it brooding around in his mind, looking for things to use against him as torture. Then he felt nothing again. Then warmth. Light. He could see a tile floor. He felt the cold tile in his hands and arms. Hey, I have hands. And arms, he noticed. He stood up, then fell. He hit the floor hard. He was not used to having legs after the eternity he'd spent being tortured. He went to open the door, but when he reached for it, it was as if he was not solid. Then the door opened and he saw Janice standing there looking like she'd been crying. He reached for her. When his hand touched her cheek, her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed. The world dissolved around James. He was in an indescribable place. He was not in a house or outside or in any setting he'd ever been in his life. Then he saw Janice. He began to talk to her. It seemed as if he was in the middle of a conversation with her that he couldn't remember. He heard himself telling her terrible stories about his childhood, and he watched as she cried and said, "I'm sorry, baby. I had no clue." He went to wrap his arms around her, and she recoiled. James's heart sank, and he looked down at his body. He was a corpse. He was not alive, talking to his wife. He was still dead. Was she dead too? How is this happening? Surely, after years of him being dead, she would have moved on by now. He saw himself wrapping his arms around Janice again. "I still love you, baby," he whispered to her. He could see the fear in Janice's eyes. He wanted to squeeze her and tell her everything will be okay, but he couldn't. He did anyway. He squeezed her tightly, and she went to push away. He squeezed tighter. He didn't want to let her go. He heard her gag and choke. He felt his arms squeezing harder around her as he whispered, "Make love to me one more time, Janice. Let's spend one last night in each other's arms." James felt sick to his stomach. He hadn't said that. I mean, it came from his mouth, but James distinctly knew it was not him speaking. Janice replied, "No, you're not here." James felt confused. He felt pure anger and hatred build up inside him. "What?" he asked. "You're not here. You're dead. And this is a dream," she exclaimed. James felt hatred and anger build up like he had never experienced before. "Oh, I'm here," he said, "and I'm going to do whatever I want to you." James felt himself reaching for something. It was what appeared to be a knife with a shape that he could only describe as ridiculous. James felt his arm jab the knife into Janice's throat. The look of fear in his wife's eyes gave James a simultaneous feeling of pleasure and absolute horror. What was he doing? He felt something oozing from his mouth. He looked down to see a puddle of inky black ooze forming below him. He grabbed Janice by the hair and pulled her to him and jabbed his dry corpse tongue into her mouth. The black ooze seemed to flow freely into Janice's throat and mouth, and he could feel the thing inside him purr with pleasure at the taste of Janice's fear and blood. She screamed. It was an inhuman, guttural cry that only comes from the mouth of someone truly encapsulated by fear and anguish. The room dissolved, and so did Janice and his hands. James felt nothing again. He heard something tell him that he had only been dead for an hour or so, and that this being would torture him and his wife and kids for the rest of eternity. James would have began crying if he had eyes. What had he done? The being held James down for what seemed like eons again. The pain of 1,000 executions and every torture James could fathom. In fact, it seemed as though if James thought of ways that his torture could be worse, within seconds he would start to feel that pain. He felt as though he was having his eyes gouged out. Someone was actively breaking and pulling all his teeth at once, while being set on fire, raped, and flayed all at once. Pure agony. James tried to scream. Nothing came out. He saw the inky black figure stand over him against a blood-red sky. The thing seemed to be laughing, and James could only see it when it allowed him, more to taunt him than anything else. Then James felt himself dissolve once again, and he was present in nothingness. James's daughter Michelle was only 7 when he passed away. She laid in her bed, tears pooling up in her eyes because she missed her daddy. Michelle hugged her teddy bear tight. She recited the prayers her mom had told her to say when she was sad. When she finished praying, the door to her closet swung open slowly. Michelle pulled her covers over her head. Her heart was pounding out of her chest. She peeked over the covers and thought she saw a figure in the doorway of the closet. She quickly pulled the covers back over her face. She heard footsteps from the closet moving closer to her. Then she felt a hand on her. Someone grabbed the blankets and yanked them off her face. It was her daddy. He looked like a zombie from a movie with jet black eyes. "Daddy?" Michelle squeaked. "Yes, baby. It's me. It's just me." "Daddy's here for you, honey," he replied. Michelle felt her eyes fill with tears. "We miss you, Daddy. Mommy cries all the time," she said. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm here now. You won't feel any more pain," he replied. His hand wrapped around her neck gently at first, but then he squeezed. Michelle gasped as he clenched his hands around her throat, squeezing. She screamed a muffled, choked scream. She flailed like a fish out of water, desperately grabbing at her hands and crying. She felt her consciousness start to fade. Her skin was cold, her eyes were filled with tears, and her mouth and nose were foaming as she gasped for air. Things started to go black, and she felt cold. James found himself in a dark room. It appeared to be a bedroom. His daughter's bedroom. He saw the window off to his left, and to his right lay his little girl Michelle. Michelle tugged her blanket over her face. James walked closer to the bed. He grabbed the covers and gave him a gentle tug. She was holding the blankets down on her face. James gave the blankets a yank. The covers flew off with way more force than he had intended. "Daddy?" Michelle said. "Yes, baby, it's just me. Daddy's here for you, honey," he replied. "We miss you, Daddy," she said with tears in her eyes. "Mommy cries all the time." "It's okay, baby. I'm here now. You won't feel any more pain," he told her. He then felt himself moving his hands, wrapping them gently around her neck. Then he felt himself squeeze. So hard, in fact, he thought sure her head would pop off. She screamed a choked scream, and James could feel her flailing under him. She gasped for air, and her eyes filled with tears as her mouth and nose started to foam. Then she was limp. James tried to scream out in pain, but he couldn't. James was not in control after all. He was. The being took control of James's corpse and walked out of Michelle's room, down the hall to Randy's room. He was a tough kid, only 12 years old. As he walked into Randy's room, he could smell something foul coming from the direction of the closet. James looked around the room for Randy, but no sign of him. Randy was a big baseball fan. Memorabilia from all eras littered the walls. James walked around the room, trying to think of where his son had gone. The smell was overpowering. It seemed to be coming from the closet. James inched towards the closet door to open it. He turned the knob and pulled the door open, and he laughed out loud. There, hanging from a coat rack, was Randy. Hung himself with his own bed sheets. Just 12 years old. James felt a surge of panic rise up inside him, and also laughter. An insane laughter that he didn't understand the origin of. He heard the door open behind him. He turned around to see Janice standing there, staring through him at their son, hanging in his closet. She let out a terrible scream and ran out the door. She ran to Michelle's room to grab her and run out of the house. When she got to Michelle's room, she pulled the covers off to reveal a tiny, bloody corpse, neck deformed like it was crushed in a vice. Janice collapsed. Everyone she had ever loved was now dead. She lay back on the floor with a cold blankness in her eyes. James could do nothing. He watched Janice slowly get up and walk to the window. It was the third story of the house. She really was all alone in this cruel world. She opened the window and dove out head first. Her neck was broken upon impact, and she died. James felt himself dissolve again. Then he was standing in a room with a man. No, James was not in the room. The man was talking to James's parents in some strange language, and they were dancing in some weird ritual. James saw himself as a toddler, laying on a stone slab, asleep, unconscious, not moving. They seemed to be performing a ritual on him. What was going on here? James heard a voice that sounded like thunder say something in a strange alien language that sounded more like clicks and pops than actual words. The toddler started shaking violently, and a deep voice came from his body, but it was not his. He could not understand the words, but it was as if a light bulb had come on in his brain. He began to dissolve again. He felt the despair come back, and the only thing he was able to see is the silhouette of a tall shadow creature. The dark being, the inky menace. James was no longer James. James was nothing. The torture began again. James could hear the cries of his family. They would spend eternity together, souls being devoured by the dark, shadowy predator.